the typical reaction that cybersecurity leaders have taken was to just add more staff, continue to increase more tooling, more scanners in the attempt to solve every vulnerability. And the reality is it can't scale, it can't work.
SC Media is proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. Hi, I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Julian Mihai, CISO at Penn Medicine. Welcome, Julian.
Great to be here, Todd.
So tell me, what's your journey in cybersecurity been like, and what made you want to enter this field?
You know, for me, it's been more of an accident. I actually started early in my career in application and coding development, actually very, very low level, working on microprocessor software, assembly language, coding, and as cybersecurity started growing in the early 2000s, I found myself having that skill set of a security hacker, if you will, and the ability to understand, given my background, how these vulnerabilities and the attacks worked. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder and say, we need somebody like you, and that's how I transitioned. And from there, went across industries, got a chance to experience the journey of cybersecurity from the early days to a very sophisticated operation these days. It's been a lot of fun, continues to be that way, and again, I think in short, it found me.
You know, I love hearing that, and maybe we should rename this from CISO Stories to the CISO Accidents, because it seems like most people that have entered this field didn't choose it, and today we have a whole generation that are choosing this field, which is really nice, but we have to have that historical perspective that many times it was people just ended up in the field because it really wasn't this real formalized profession then.
20 years ago, I don't know if there existed any formal cybersecurity program at any university. I think actually they were pretty late to catch on this, maybe 10, 15 years ago when it started.
Yeah, so now where it seems like we have this mature industry in so many ways, we're still an evolving industry, and I've written about that in the CISO Compass book, the whole evolution of the CISO role that's been over the last 30 years, but we keep evolving it, and it really has only been 30 years. So there's so much we can learn. So today we're going to be talking about vulnerability management on focus, breadth, depth, and reducing the vulnerabilities without breaking the bank. So tell us a little bit about that. What's your experience been with vulnerability management and how we should be approaching that?
Yeah, I think that's a subject that it's really close to heart. It's not just vulnerabilities where I find this approach that we as practitioner tended to to have, where we're looking at everything that exists in our environment and we're trying to fix, monitor, address all vulnerabilities. And that may have worked in the days where you only had a firewall, but now with the explosion of applications, devices, cloud, and continuing to grow, the typical reaction that cybersecurity leaders have taken was to just add more staff, continue to increase more tooling, more scanners, in the attempt to solve every vulnerability. And the reality is, it can scale, it can't work. So I think that the solution has to come from a tiering of what are the types of vulnerabilities or exposures that can cause the highest impact. So if you think about the cloud perimeter, if you think about the network perimeter, devices that are exposed on the internet, and then even then moving on to end user devices, users that browse, right? That's part of the perimeter. That's part of the frontier. Is it a problem that maybe an internal application has a vulnerability? It's absolutely something that we want to monitor, of course. But putting things in balance, you have your typical enterprise, large enterprise has thousands, some tens of thousands of applications. It's going to take an army of people to manage that. And the flip side is you still have the same leadership over a vulnerability management program, right? Even if it's a director or similar level, they're going to have their focus diluted by trying to look at everything, being measured on everything. I advocate for first getting perfect and 100% perfect at the key perimeter devices. And those are typically in the hundreds. The cloud presence, and moving on to the way the attack goes from outside in. And then incrementally, as you're able to make those investment versus risk decisions, every unit or resource allocation goes deeper and deeper. But it gives you the chance to say, if I'm a smaller organization in particular, less funded, I can do a high impact job on vulnerability management, even with one person, and protect against the most egregious, the most critical vulnerabilities, versus using that one person to try to solve everything in a larger enterprise.
So how do you go about identifying and making sure that you have the most critical devices that you're worried about?
I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. Following the most recent incidents is one aspect of it. I think overall looking at the cyber threat intelligence as a driver of that program is something that many organizations miss, right? They just use vulnerability without the risk context. And the risk context means what's the first point of attack, inventorying that, making sure that you're the first to know if something is vulnerable, and you're the first one to patch those that are vulnerable, particularly on the perimeter. And then even more razor focus on vulnerabilities that have been recently exploited, and making sure that you have ways to continuously test for it, detect it, and stay on top of it.
And so then, as you're looking at all these vulnerabilities, given that most of the breaches are involving a smaller number of vulnerabilities than the total population, how do you go about prioritizing those vulnerabilities that you're concerned about?
I think for those that are deemed critical, setting the expectation that it's going to be all hands on deck with them yields the biggest benefit. I think that's the other side of focusing and making sure that your first 100% making sure the critical exposures are addressed. It allows you to escalate to your partners, such as infrastructure patch management, on a limited basis, continue to have their support, but on the flip side, negotiate a very fast and rapid response time. So I'm a big proponent of all hands on deck when something like that is being discovered. But on the flip side, ensuring that things that are just medium ranked or lower don't raise to the same level of pressure on those teams where you burn them out and lose some of the goodwill that you need to spend when the critical ones happen.
Mm-hmm. I know I worked for one organization, and we had the different teams had scores in their vulnerabilities, so that there was a grading system, and it ended up that the teams were competing against each other to see who could get to that A grade first. Have you done anything similar to that in your organization?
Yes, we've done things like that, and they're really successful. I think another idea that can help is always connecting a little bit the dots for those folks doing patching, which typically infrastructure applications, between what it means to have a critical event like a ransomware type of attack, what that does to their work, to their ability to continue their day-to-day. Of course, all of that was going to be completely disruptive. And that's another thing where you can influence beyond the gamification, which absolutely agree it helps as well. So all of these things can come together and improve the outcomes for sure.
Is there any kind of training that you expect for people that are doing this vulnerability management that would help them to do their jobs better?
Yeah, I think there is certainly many generalistic training. I think that more than a specific trainings is a very organized mindset. I think you can train all the aspects of vulnerability management. It's not that complicated in a way, but the analytical mindset, the organization mindset, and ultimately a little bit of risk ownership where they're committed to not have any gaps in their work. I think that's what's going to, those are going to rise to the top as the most successful vulnerability managers.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think when you just mentioned risk and reducing that risk, how do you quantify that you've actually reduced the risk within your organization?
So it comes back to really taking the context of all of these vulnerabilities and being able to contextualize, not just using a CV or one of these measurements that are out of context, but put it in the context of your organization. Ideally, run it through some risk quantification program if you have that level of maturity, and being able to perhaps at the margin even put a dollar amount of what the impact of that vulnerability could have, how deep if somebody could go in, what's the really likelihood for an exploitation to happen and to become something catastrophic. And using that information, then you can stack rank and make sure that you work on the highest first, and then make sure that you address within very tight SLA that first tier.
When it comes to risk management methodologies, we've had Jack Jones from the Fair Approach on the previous CISO Stories podcast. We've had Doug Hubbard on, who wrote the book How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. Is there a risk methodology that you prefer to make that kind of an assessment?
I'm a big believer in the risk models such as FAIRS, where we're committed to that model. I think it's all of these models are very. It takes time to gain the maturity to be able to use it. So I think what I'm referring a little bit is just having the mindset of risk until you're able to get to that maturity, which requires investment work. Um, it's pretty having the pragmatic risk-based approach doesn't need all the Monte Carlo simulation and tooling that FAIRS requires. But that said, it's a very valuable tool, and I'm a big believer in those.
Yeah, I know the NIST 800 series. I think it's 800-26, if I remember correctly, is the NIST risk management framework. And they've recently even adapted that to AI to look at measuring risk in that framework as well. Are there tools, not necessarily specific vendor tools, but certain types of tools that would help with the vulnerability management, beyond the, what are we, I mean, we all know the commodity vulnerability risk or the vulnerability scanning tools that are out there, and we can bake those off of each other. But are there other tools on top of that that make this prioritization process easier?
They are. It's been a growing field. I think a couple of years ago, I'm not going to name names, but at least two well-known players and then it expanded to more and more that are able to add more context, risk context to vulnerabilities, integrate certainly with the vulnerability scanning for that initial data collection, but using additional data points regarding the value of the assets, the exposure of that asset, be able to help the team in prioritizing which vulnerabilities should be addressed first. I think it's a useful tool if you have the ability to make that investment on top of the commodity vulnerability scanner. It's an important capability. I'd say that if you have a very solid inventory, and even that can be certainly done with tooling, but here I'm more addressing this to those in very small organization. You can still have a big impact having a detailed spreadsheet of your exposed assets and making sure those are getting addressed. But yeah, certainly tooling helps and is necessary in larger organizations.
I mean, one of the problems we always get into with, when we're reporting about vulnerabilities is that the ability to tie, this server and this application and all these different components back to the business revenue stream that's being, that those devices are supporting, because most people in IT don't necessarily know the business processes. So how does that how does that work? How do we get better at that?
I think it's a little bit of an art, and honestly, in my opinion, I think it's something we wish for. I feel those are imprecise because, first off, you try to put a number on the value of having a certain critical application up all the time. What these tools have difficulties in calculating it. What happens if that application with a vulnerability gets exploited? What does it do from the perspective of giving a cyber attacker access within the entire environment, right? So let's say you have a very valuable customer-facing application, but and you know there's $1 million revenue per day associated with that application. Certainly, that's one factor. It's a really good one. It can certainly help with driving action, but at the margin, it misses perhaps, let's say you have an application that only impacts 10,000 of revenue per day, or maybe a couple of thousand revenue per day. But that application vulnerability can be exploited for somebody to get into a corporate environment, deploy ransomware, and cause hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. So that's where it's easy to make that case with application-based calculations. But I feel like you're at risk of missing some really big contextual decision if your application is not really that important. I mean, the reality is that's the challenge. You can have a vulnerability on a cafeteria menu that can really lead to $100 million impact. So how do you represent that? How you detect that? I don't know of any tools that can give you that insight.
So how do we balance that? I love that you use the cafeteria menu because that's always the thing that we use of
Right.
information that's not very critical. And I think before we had the ransomware, I'd say pre 2017 era when ransomware was out there, but it was very small. It wasn't targeted at organizations as much as individuals. But when NotPetya and WannaCry came onto the scene, then it became a question of it's not the fact that you have data that they want, it's that you have data that you need and you don't want it disclosed to anybody else and you need it to run your business. And so any entry point becomes that point. So how do we balance that then with being focused on vulnerabilities while at the same time trying to protect these other places that could be entry points for lateral movement and causing problems in other areas.
I think, and that's where adding that risk context to a vulnerability is such a difficult task, and it's one that requires some savvy human-based involvement, because you have to take in context here the other mitigations that you may have in your environment as well. Certainly vulnerability management is not in itself going to be the one thing that protects against a ransomware. You have to couple it with solutions such as segmentations, both at the network level, at the application level, identity-based microsegmentation, ensuring that you have safeguard backup. So there are many mitigations that work in conjunction, and those need to be factored in your vulnerability prioritization as well. Let's say an application may be vulnerable, but it's low impact. It's exposed to the internet, but there's no way for that application, if exploited, to connect back into the rest of the environment. That completely shifts the risk profile of that vulnerability. So again, taking the mitigations that you have in place, it's an important factor that we don't want to miss in this equation.
Great advice. Well, this has been fantastic. What sort of final advice would you give to emerging CISOs, new CISOs, experienced CISOs, or current CISOs as they're trying to improve their vulnerability management processes?
I think maybe many of the seasoned CISOs have discovered this over time, but maybe this is something where I hope more and more can adopt, particularly in smaller and medium-sized organizations that don't have the staffing that they might need in particular. Just be razor focused on the most critical assets, know everything about them, know everything that they're connected to, know everything as far as mitigations that exist in place, and make sure that they get those critical assets, critical risky assets, 100% managed from a vulnerability management at a very, very low SLAs, and then build from there. Don't try to address vulnerability management as a blanket shared service, bottoms up, because that dilutes focus and leads to cases where obvious critical vulnerabilities are missed and gets exploited. We see that every day, and I wish we could avoid that. It's painful.
That's great advice. Thanks a lot for taking the time with us today.
Thank you, Todd. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Mihai. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.